Hello all. Welcome to our presentation on assessing the performance of grape assessment procedures. My name is Dr. Eric Wilkes. I'm the General Manager of Commercial and Regulatory Affairs for the Australian Wine Research Institute. Now, in response to the ACCC review of wine grape pricing, several industry-endorsed standard procedures, IESPs for short, for quantitative measurement were developed. Now, these procedures are to be used when assessing quantitative parameters applied to the pricing of grapes, and they're there to ensure consistency and fairness. In the case of disputes, it may be necessary for third parties to review the evidence for adherence to these procedures for any individual sites. And what we're going to cover in this talk is a generalized overview of what needs to be reviewed. Now, this slide just gives an overview of the documents that are available. And I'd like to draw your attention to the wine grape assessment in the vineyard booklet, which was developed to give an overview of what you should be looking at when you're trying to assess quality of grapes in the vineyard. But underlying anything that's used as payment are what we call the industry endorsed standard procedures. And these are the formal detailed procedures that set out exactly how you should measure these items, in particular, color and sugar. Now, the core primary methods for the assessment of grapes are covered by these ISPs. And as I said, they cover Brix and Baumé, also known as total dissolved solids, and regularly just referred to as sugar and color. But they are also supported by IESPs for sampling and the assessment of matter other than grapes, because these obviously do have a significant impact on the quality of the measurements, as well as the suitability of material for use. When you assess if a site has conformed with the requirements of primary methods, the following core considerations should be covered: validation, quality assurance, and record keeping. Now, validation is the process that each laboratory must use when first setting up the method to show that it is performing to expectations. It is only required when the method is first set up or if a significant change is made to the method. In general, it requires that there be comparison of a set of samples with a reference laboratory and also a set of duplicate tests, usually around a minimum of 7, to demonstrate reproducibility and uncertainty of measurement. The site should have detailed records of validation procedures and should be able to show that nothing has changed since this was done. Now, the details of each of these requirements for validation is outlined in the IESP for the given method. One important side note I'd like to point out here is that when a site develops an uncertainty of measurement based on their testing, that information should be used when they develop their tolerances for what they will accept within grapes, because understanding that the amount that is covered by the variation in measurement is very important to understanding whether a given number should be used for that tolerance. The next thing that should be assessed is quality assurance. Quality assurance is a process that the site will use to demonstrate that the procedures are performing consistently and that there are no issues. At the beginning of the season or before it, the site should have done some comparative performance tests with another recognised facility, or perhaps been involved in a ring test for these tests. On each day, the site should also have done a zero test, i.e. comparing it to something like water, and standard checks for known values. These can be materials that have been frozen or artificial standards which have been made up, such as sugar standards for Brix and Baumé measures. At least one set of replicate samples should have been done and been shown to be consistent on any given day of testing. Records of daily QA should be clear and available, and if there was a non-conformance at any time, the process to rectify this issue should be noted. It's important that the site demonstrate that if there was an issue, they've done something to ensure that the measurements that were output for that day or any given period were correct and valid. For each of the ISPs, the detailed requirements for QA are set out in the document. Two other items should always be reviewed when looking at the suitability of testing at a site. Improper sampling has the potential to add much greater errors to results than minor variations in the actual testing procedures, and it can be argued is the most important component of any testing. Any review should investigate the sampling methodology used and that it met the standards outlined in the IESPs. In a case of a vineyard sampling, ideally some form of GPS, global positioning satellite, tracking will be used to demonstrate adequate sample coverage. If it's not available, a clear demonstration of the procedures and the standards used for sampling is required. For weighbridge sampling, the individual results that made up the average for the batch should be available, and they should be able to demonstrate that there was not a significant variation within the batch which would have led to the possibility of greater errors. The other IESP, which is quite relevant here, is that for matter other than grapes, or MOG. This is based on the comparison of visual appearance of loads to standard images for different levels of MOG and is very well known and accepted within the industry. Ideally, if a load of fruit is to be rejected based on MOG content, then photographic evidence of all rejected bins will be kept and available as time-stamped photos. It has to be acknowledged, however, that the standard IESPs for sugar and colour aren't always the most appropriate for all facilities, especially in very large facilities with high throughput. Secondary procedures may be required. Now, a secondary procedure is one that uses a substantially different technology or methodology than that outlined in the IESPs, and these may be used, but they must be shown to be equivalent of the IESPs or the primary methods to ensure fair and accurate results. Such methods are often used because they offer the ability to have a much higher sample throughput, often with greatly reduced inputs of labour or resources. Examples that are used in the industry include NIR and FTIR methods. However, because these methods do not usually directly measure the analyte in question, but use spectroscopy with advanced calculations, the level of validation required is much higher, and significant work is needed to demonstrate each year that vintage or varietal variations are not impacting the performance of the method. Generally, each year, sufficient samples across all varieties, for instance, 10% of the total number of samples or 100 samples, whichever is lower, must be tested against the primary methods to show that the results are comparable. This comparison can not only use samples from the beginning of the season, but must demonstrate conformance across the season. As with primary methods, consistent sampling practices must also be assessed to ensure the validity of the samples being tested. The detailed requirements for the validation QA are set out in the relevant IESP. Now, this has just been an overall review of the assessment process, and we are more than open to providing extra information or advice wherever possible. And we'd like to thank all the people who've been heavily involved in putting together not just the IESPs, but developing the processes that support them. Thank you for your time.